Do you remember how good Jak X Combat Racing was? I sure don't, because I only played it for the first time this week, but that's my excuse. Why the hell doesn't anyone else remember this game? Even Google seems to have forgotten about it, because when you search for kart racing games, it doesn't even make the list, but Mortal Kombat Armageddon does. On second thought, this might not be the most reliable list. So what exactly is it about Jak X Combat Racing that not only keeps it out of the conversation of great kart races, but out of the conversation of video games in general? Oh, great questions. Yeah, let's talk about those today. I grew up in an era where Mario Kart was the gold standard of not just kart races, but borderline video games full stop. So it was just a great time. For anyone that had a copy of Mario Kart, I never actually had one because every time I asked for Mario Kart, Mum would say we have Mario Kart at home. But Mario Kart at home was Shrek Smash and Crash Racing, so arguably, Ogres Rock! Not exactly the same thing. And maybe it was because of my obsessive focus over Mario Kart that I didn't even know Jak X was a thing until recently. Or maybe it's because it wasn't your traditional kart racer. Jak X Combat Racing is not just part Mario Kart, but it's also part Burnout, or in other terms, you could consider it as an early prototype for the highly underrated MotorStorm games. Now, you might be thinking, why would a franchise go from this to this?
I'm gonna kill Praxis!
To this.
Go!
Well, Jak and Daxter weren't the only PlayStation platforming duo that had a bit of a midlife crisis thanks to it being the eve of the next generation of consoles. Ratchet & Clank also went through similar growing pains, but as has always been the case between these two series, they still somehow managed to share a heck of a lot of similarities. Ignoring the obvious comparisons between our pointy-eared protagonists and their tiny backpack companions, both games act as a direct sequel and force you to compete in death sports for the entertainment of the everyman, with refusal resulting in your death. We have evil organizers, quirky commentators, and these two games even released only a week apart. But despite the alarming number of similarities, there are still three huge key differences between the two that we're going to deep dive into right now. Difference 1. Ratchet Deadlocked did not have a character that looked like Lord Farquaad if he left Neverland and had a growth spurt. Difference 2. The plot. Despite the overall premise being largely similar, where Deadlocked arguably had one of the weaker stories of its franchise, I honestly think that Jak X might have one of the stronger ones. Despite the game basically being considered a spin-off, this in no way feels like the plot you would expect to find in any other spin-off game. Not only are fans of the series immediately rewarded with almost all of the main characters reuniting once again, but the story and all the characters are all really well written. While the game itself was intentionally designed to be a smaller project, and we'll get to that in more detail at the end, this was not one area that they skimped on. The game includes not one twist, but two, and both of them were unexpected, and I would imagine anyone that really connected with the story of Jak 2 would find a lot to be happy with in this game. It even ends with a change to the status quo that is just begging for a sequel to explore it more. No, obviously I wasn't talking about you. Look, if I need you, I'll put your name in the title, otherwise just stay out of my videos. But these first two differences really pale in comparison to difference 3, and this is the big one, the gameplay. Both Jak X and Ratchet Deadlock took their franchises in new directions and both chose to double down on existing elements they'd already introduced in their games. Funnily enough, it was these same elements that really were arguably the biggest difference between the two franchises in the first place. While both games had combat and vehicles by the end of their trilogies, Ratchet had prioritized combat as shown by their arenas, whereas Jak had prioritized its vehicles as shown by their time trials, races, and overall level design. So yes, these games are similar in principle, but they are literally nothing alike when it comes to the gameplay. And this is the most important thing to remember about Jak X Combat Racing, because while yes, this game does have a surprising amount of story and cutscenes, and yes, there is a guy that looks like Gaston if he just didn't give a fuck about games, ultimately, this is a game that was about driving and only driving. And that's not a bad thing, considering this is what the best kart racers do, which brings us back to the original point. What is it that makes a kart racer not only successful, but stand the test of time? While that might sound like a steep bar to set for it, keep in mind that this is in fact a 17-year-old game now, so standing the test of time goes from being an accomplishment when playing it back in 2005 to being almost a prerequisite when playing it in 2022. Now, instead of just telling you how I think the best kart racers achieve this, let's instead just talk about what this game does and see if you can piece it together for yourself. First, we're going to start with the racing. There are 2 game modes to be played and 9 different race types. Adventure mode is where you go for your single player story, whereas exhibition mode is where you would jump in for quick races with your friends or AI if you don't have any of those yet. These race types range from your classic circuit races and death matches to slightly more interesting ideas like an event called Rush Hour where you have to score points by driving head on into oncoming traffic, or Turbo Dash where you score points by collecting power cells and boosting around the track until they're fully charged. In addition to these 9 events, there are another 2 that are specific to the exhibition mode, with one being a fairly standard time trial and the other being a more interesting event called Assassin. All of these are pretty neat if not necessarily complicated and do add a good mix of variety into what is otherwise a pretty traditional kart racer. Now yes, I know Mario Kart 64 was almost half a decade earlier than this game, but even that only had 4 different race types, and just think about the replayability you got from that. That's your first clue. Next are the tracks themselves. A kart racer is normally only as fun as its tracks, and fortunately, Jak X has quite a few of them. Kind of. The tracks are split across 4 main areas: Sparga City, Haven City, Crash City, and the Icelands. 2 of these areas are returning locations from Jak 3, whereas 2 of them are brand new for this game. This gives the tracks a good blend of old and new, but it is worth pointing out that even the old locations of Spargas and Haven City have a different layout compared to the earlier games. Within each of these areas, there are normally 4 to 5 different tracks in each that show you different parts of the level until you get further into the game and you suddenly realize, hang on a second, it's all just one big level. Most kart racers are notorious for designing their tracks to be one and done. Sure, there might be branching paths within them, but say you love Bowser's Castle, you can't just get more of that location unless you play the same track over and over again. There's your second clue. Finally are the characters and vehicles. One of the things that makes licensed kart racers immediately superior to unlicensed kart racers are the characters. Rather than playing as a bunch of either generic or user-created avatars, you get to play as some of the most recognizable characters in the world depending on your kart racer of choice. Don't get me wrong, the location of the tracks themselves are also a huge part of the license, but I often find that I'm always way more likely to recognize the characters I'm racing as or against than I am to recognize the locations I'm racing in, especially if I haven't played the game before. Jak X has done a wonderful job with the choice of characters you can race as, which include not only the main cast from previous entries, but also all the new races that have been added in for this game. In addition to that, you can also race as all the different multiverse versions of Jak from the previous titles, and you can also race as Ratchet, but not just any Ratchet. Specifically, this is the Ratchet from Ratchet Deadlock, linking these 2 games together yet again. Now, while this is great and gives me just the best Star Wars Episode 1 racer vibes, these are all just cosmetic at the end of the day. The only thing that gives you any sort of difference in the racing itself is the vehicle. Like the characters, the vehicles get unlocked by playing through the adventure mode, with better vehicles unlocking as you progress further. In addition to just unlocking them, you also have the opportunity to customize them, and this can be done to improve either the performance or to improve it cosmetically. While it's not an incredibly deep system, it was a nice distraction every few races going in and messing around with the look and the feel for the rides themselves. That's the final clue. So, did you figure it out? What is the thing that makes a kart racer not only successful, but stand the test of time? Well, that, my dear friends, would be variety, and the right amount of it at that. Absolutely. Other things are going to contribute to this as well, like the mechanics, the controls, even just what sort of multiplayer offerings it has. But the thing that above all made these games great and kept you coming back was the variety. And you know what else has variety? This channel. As well as Jak and Daxter, I cover Ratchet and Clank, Sly Cooper, as well as a bunch of other classic games, so if you're interested, consider hitting that subscribe button. Otherwise, if you don't want to commit long term, I totally get that. Even just leaving a like goes a long way for me. I would really appreciate it. But enough about that. Does Jak X have variety? It absolutely does. It has variety falling out its butt. We just talked about the number of races, tracks, and even vehicles at your disposal. So why is it not being talked about as one of the best kart races of all time? Well, it's because it has the perfect amount of variety, just unfortunately, it's all in the wrong places. Let's go back through those 3 points again in a bit more detail, shall we? Starting back with our race types. Now, at first glance, having 11 different race types should be more than enough to check the variety box when it comes to keeping things fresh, but it's not necessarily the case. There could have been 50 different race types, and it probably would have had the same problem. It's the same reason as to why Mario Kart 64 only had those 4 different race modes and stayed replayable for years. At the end of the day, regardless of what your objective was, every event felt the same. Whether you were racing AI, smashing into oncoming drones, or taking them down from behind, you were still going around the same tracks with your vehicles still handling exactly the same way. I would argue that out of the 11 different types of events, there were really only 2 types of events that were actually different. You would either be having your event on a circuit track, or you would be having your events in an open stadium style environment. It's actually a similar flaw that you would find in early open world games, where to fill up a huge world, it was littered with fetch quests. Whether you were picking something up from someone or taking something to someplace else, at the end of the day, you were still just running back and forth across the map. Well, that's basically what's happening here. Imagine as a developer being given a circuit track and being told to come up with 9 different events for it, but also being told that you can only use the mechanics that have been made for circuit races. Not an easy thing to do. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't make the game bad by any stretch, but what it does make it is repetitive, and repetitive is not a word that normally hangs out in the same sentences as variety. So then, why did Mario Kart not have the same problems? Because it had the same structure of having circuit tracks and having open battle maps. Well, let's talk about the difficulty. Kart races normally go in one of 2 directions: accessible like Mario Kart and its rubber banding to level the playing fields, or skill-based like CTR and its boosting mechanics. Committing to one of these has both pros and cons, but in turn, it attracts a slightly different audience, meaning that they can both thrive in the same space. When I started playing Jak X, I thought, holy this is not a walk in the park. I was barely winning races, the competition felt tight, and even small mistakes would leave me lagging behind. This was way more like CTR than Mario Kart. But then I played through 2 cups, or in other words, over 35 races, and I didn't lose a single one. Yes, that is a mad flex, but it's also not, because there were plenty of times where I was coming dead last, but somehow I would always get back to the front just before the race ended. Not only that, but if I'd been in the lead for an entire race, when I finished, the game would tell me I'd only gotten first by a matter of milliseconds. But this was every race. I mean, when have you ever seen results like this so consistently when versing AI? The worst part about it was that every other event outside of the circuit races was a walk in the park. In death matches where the conditions were first to 10 kills, I would score 10 when the next closest would score 4. If I needed 400 points to get a gold medal, I'd be scoring hundreds of points above that. This game was in fact much more like Mario Kart when it came to difficulty, but it wanted to act like it was a Crash Team Racing. Unlike Mario Kart where you can choose your difficulty to suit your level, here you're forced to go through the game's pacing. So while it did get more difficult as the game went on, by the time I got there, I was already blowing through the game, and that's when the repetition was really setting in. Okay, but the tracks. Not only is there variety, but they're pretty unique as well. And I still don't know whether I like it or not. While the tracks themselves are well themed, again, they're pretty straightforward. Once you hit that point where you realize that all the tracks connect to create 4 distinct larger tracks, it's quite cool at first, like the moment you unlock a shortcut in a Souls game. But because you're focused on racing and not exploring, you're not expecting that to happen, and the moment just kind of falls flat. It feels like it was intended to make the players feel like these were real cities that had their own geography, almost like they were opening and closing down streets for a street race. How it came across though was that 4 big circuits were originally designed, and then just little chunks were taken out of it to make content more quickly. Then finally, there are the characters and vehicles. I have literally not a bad thing to say about the roster in this game. The selection is fantastic, they have these fun little character portraits at the selection screen. Honestly, just overall a great time. The vehicles though, now I have a bone to pick with the vehicles. As with everything else I've covered so far, bad? No. Bland? Yes. Starting with tier 1 vehicles, you unlock new tiers when you complete one of the 4 cups, giving you a newer, cooler vehicle to use for the next competition. This is always exciting when this happens, but there is just one small speed bump you hit, which is that the vehicles never feel different. If anything, each vehicle kind of feels like a downgrade compared to the one that you just gave up. As I mentioned earlier, this game has an upgrade system. Here, you can exchange precursor orbs won throughout races and spend those upgrading things like top speed, acceleration, boost capacity, regular car stuff. When you start the game, you're given 2 standard vehicles, one designed very much for racing and one designed very much for vehicular devastation, and I use them accordingly. Until I realized, instead of trying to upgrade 2 cars, it would probably be better to just upgrade the armor on my race car and just use 1 car for everything, so I started doing that. By the time I had finished the first cup, I hadn't even fully upgraded this car before I was given a tier 2 vehicle and started a new cup, where the cars I'd just gotten were vanilla as fuck. I was starting from the bottom again and had taken 1 step forward in the campaign, but 2 steps backwards with the vehicles. Remember before how I said, while it did get more difficult as the game went on, yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is the culprit. When you get a higher tier car that looks more badass, you would expect the competition to increase, sure, but it's also because you expect your new car to be faster or better in some way. But it just wasn't until you went back and you upgraded it. Now, I know that this is probably all sounding quite nitpicky, especially since it's nothing new for kart racers to offer different stats for vehicles or even give you the ability to customize them with different parts for different benefits. But they don't lock you behind a finite resource. In those other games, you can experiment freely, mix and match parts with vehicles or just try different vehicles to see what feels better for you. In Jak X though, you have to commit to those decisions before you even know how impactful the upgrade's going to be, and by doing so, it discourages you from trying different vehicles along the way. I mean, you tell me, why would you use a car that's not been upgraded at all if you've already got one that you've put every nickel and dime into? Overall though, Jak X Combat Racing is a great kart racer, and it does all the things you would expect a great kart racer to do. It has random weapon pickups, defensive items, boosting systems, and a solid multiplayer, even if that is restricted just to split screen these days. But by trying to provide so much variety, it's achieved that by becoming a jack of all trades but a master of none. And Jak is spelt J-A-K there, so that does in fact make it a pun. Even so, there is a reasonable explanation behind all of this. Remember when I mentioned ages ago that this game was designed to be a smaller project? Well, that's because there was a lot happening at Naughty Dog at the time. Not only were they transitioning from the PS2 to the PS3, with teams starting to drop off to work on the original Uncharted as part of that process, but the original founders of the studio and key minds behind Jak and Daxter, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin, were also leaving the company. It was designed to be quick with a small budget using the existing resources from Jak 3. So in other words, it wasn't necessarily designed to try and dethrone the best kart racers in the biz. This led to reviewers even at the time praising the graphics and story, while also finding the gameplay repetitive and the game overall not doing anything massively new. With this in mind, it also explains why we have so many different race events that are all using the same mechanics, why 4 big tracks were made with smaller tracks just being chopped out from them, and why vehicle upgrades, the only element in this game that hadn't been tested in a previous Jak title, well, why maybe they did more harm than good. Add on top of that the usual competition and overlap of audiences for Ratchet and Clank, a whole new console generation coming out the following year, and until recently, the lack of support around anything to do with Jak and Daxter, and it starts to make sense as to why this game could be forgotten about. But if you're still here watching this, then you most certainly haven't forgotten about it, and to you I would say this is still a super fun game to play today in 2022. Just don't play it like I did and do it all in a single sitting. If you want more Jak and Daxter, then I've got great news for you. A port is now available on PC, and it's not at all what you think it is, but also way better than you could possibly imagine. This video here is going to tell you all about that, so definitely worth checking out. I'll see you over there. Let's go!
I'm not gonna lie, daughter had fun, her brain fried. My lady Papa's